Welcome to Studio 21. We're going to be talking about the Performance Plus series coming up for Tulsa Community College. Our guest, Barry Epperley, and let's get your official title first here.
I'm the director of the Performing Arts Institute at TCC and the music director of the Signature Symphony at TCC.
A lot of people know you just because of the Signature Symphony and your work all throughout the community. Interesting series of lectures and some music that you're going to be presenting for the Tulsa community. You've divided this up into 3 different segments.
Yes.
The first segment goes from 1840 to 1935.
Yes.
What kind of music did America have in the 1840s?
A real wide variety of things, actually. You know, people had begun to travel. All over the United States, there were saloons, but there were saloons that became show houses. And so there were actually troupes that began in the 1840s and 50s. The one group that we know most is called the Christy Minstrels. Now, those of us who grew up in the folk age in this last century remember the new Christy Minstrels that did Barry Maguire and Eve of Destruction and all those other things. But the original Christy Minstrels, it was a small group for a while, somewhere around 5 to 10, that grew to 50, and they traveled year-round.
And they were at saloons.
They were at saloons, they were at opera houses, they were, and you know, if you've gone to the old gold rush places, like up in Telluride, they have an opera house, or different places around, Ouray has an opera house, a lot of places in Colorado, and up and down the Rockies, it was an ongoing thing, as well as on the West Coast. So they would travel significant numbers of places, and they would do shows that were little bits. People would put them on for maybe 10 minutes or 12 minutes, so that they would have 10 different acts. They would do Shakespeare. They would do music from opera. People like Caruso traveled all over. Now, he was a little later. But the Christy Minstrels were the first group that we know as identified, and Stephen Foster became their home for their music. They didn't really have a lot of American music up until that time.
The next really traditional American music that we can put our hands around really is ragtime. And it's such, I mean, ragtime encompasses so much. A lot of us first think of Scott Joplin. You'd mentioned Stephen Foster dying in poverty. Scott Joplin had the same unfortunate legacy, but the musical legacy was powerful. It was,
and you know, Scott Joplin, his Redback book that was republished in 1950s and 60s and taken up, I mean, it's orchestrated. There were movies that had extensive parts of his Redback book. But you've got to remember that ragtime was nasty. It was in the places that it shouldn't have been. Well, people shouldn't have been. The pianist was over in the corner playing ragtime in brothels, in places where women and children, other than the ladies of the night, would have been in those places, and mostly it was saloons. And that really wasn't a developing part of the music. Now, he's the one that we know, but there were a number of other people who wrote rags for about 30 to 40 years until there were things that turned it around about the change of the century. In 1911, for instance, Irving Berlin wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band, and he was it was to be played in a new genre of music houses.
Vaudeville.
Vaudeville, you bet. Vaudeville changed everything, because up until this time, and we see it in the old movies. I love Tombstone, for instance. They are doing Shakespeare. They're doing forms of ballet. They're singing, and it's only the guys sitting around, and when they like something, they shot into the ceiling or whatever they might shoot into at the time.
We seem to have a trend here with music that it starts in one area that may not be as respectable and then moves into kind of respectable society.
Yes. There was a gentleman, actually several gentlemen in New York City. They saw this really as, I mean, it's very American. They saw it as a marketing tool because they figured that we're missing half the population. We have these guys coming in, they bring their guns, they get drunk. You can't have civil people here. So he puts a sign out and says, "Women and children, welcome." And he changed the show. And he changed, they had to, and this was the other thing that it shifted across the American West, they had to check their guns. So they would come in and he would take their guns and he would hang them over behind the bar, and that way they had to behave if they wanted their gun back. They could drink, yes, but they had to be civil because the kids were over here. And then the shows became civil, and that was the early vaudeville.
Let me talk. You have ragtime.
Yes.
What's the transition from ragtime to jazz?
Well, there were several things that were going on right there. You know, we hadn't had any real musicians being trained in this country. So the people who played ragtime, it was just their natural, it was their natural musical voice. Now, it came also, if you look a little deeper into it, the slave songs of the Deep South that continued through this time. I mean, it was still the rule as opposed to the accident, the unusual part, that there were slave songs that were developed into gospel, and the people who could play, like Scott Joplin and numerous others, especially just north. St. Louis was a big place. Kansas City was a big place. And they would set up Memphis, they would set up in the bars. And they became very, very popular. But it also took that basis of the only music that we have ever shipped out from this country. It's the only music that we have shared with the rest of the world. And it becomes ragtime, jazz, and the jazz, of course, has morphed into 100 different settings of jazz. But then the other side of it was what had been here from Europe. Our composers that we shipped to Paris, say, to study at the Paris Conservatory, or into Germany, they went over and they studied with the masters, or we brought Dvorak over here. We started the Juilliard School of Music in 1890s. And what he was trying to do was set up a whole new American school of music, and that's why he wrote the Symphony to the New World. You know that, and during that period of time, it was really only 3 years, but they paid him an exorbitant amount of money. He wrote music the whole time he was here. He visited the Bohemian enclave in Iowa, where they had the Bohemian beer, and he would spend 2 and 3 months in the summer. But he wrote symphonies, he wrote concertos, he wrote small ensembles, he wrote songs, and there were other people then that took his teaching and became the stars of the old school, but then that morphed into the new school. So about that period of time, from the 1890s to the 1920s or so, you see people like George M. Cohan, who started in vaudeville, but they wouldn't pay him enough and they wouldn't give him top billing, so it really made him mad. And in 1905, I believe, he wrote a whole musical called Johnny Jones.
Little Johnny Jones.
Little Johnny Jones. And in that is Give My Regards to Broadway and I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy. And it's a book show. Now that's a new thing, because you had Victor Herbert and you had Sigmund Romberg writing in the old style, in the European style, and the music was like Franz Lehar or Strauss or the others from Europe. But then you got this guy who steps up and he writes Give My Regards to Broadway and Yankee Doodle Dandy and a number of other things. And there were 4 Cohans. It wasn't just George. There were 4 in the family. He signs to do a vaudeville house. And so everything has to be good. You know, there's there's women, there's children, there's parents, grandparents.
And during this period of time, we have thousands of vaudeville houses all across America.
About 2,000 of them. About 2,000 of them. And people worked 50 plus weeks a year to do 10 minutes a night. That's all they did, 10 minutes a night. It could be magic, magic shows. It could be, they could sing, they could have dogs. There was one of the most popular, sort of like today, was a muscle builder. And then as now, this guy doesn't have much on. He's got on a skimpy little, his BVDs, and he walks out and he shows his muscles and he turns around, and then there are women dancing around him. They kept it fairly clean, but he was one of the #1 attractions in 2,000 houses.
So you're kind of a progression with vaudeville becomes, quote, the legitimate theater with music.
Yes.
You have Cohen, you have Flo Ziegfeld,
Yes.
and you're getting into the 1920s. First talking movie, Jazz Singer.
Jazz Singer, 1927.
How did that impact American music?
Changed everything. Changed absolutely everything. Now, and you have to think also that many of the people who were the early composers, George M. Cohan, of course, George Gershwin,
Cole Porter.
Cole Porter,
Yeah.
and he was a little bit later, but about the same time.
Rodgers, Hart, Hammerstein.
Rodgers and Hart, but I've lost my God Bless America. Boy, I hate this.
Well, we'll work that one out. We're going to have that as a pop quiz for the people who are watching to identify that and send it back to us. But you got, the movies really went into music so much, and you had Busby Berkeley and the eye candy of the dancing with the music and all that.
Well, that's what, I'm sorry, but if you go back to Florence Ziegfeld, he was the genius behind the transformation. Now, yes, there were 2 or 3 people that had their vaudeville houses, but Flo Ziegfeld then took it and he became the master at building an entire show. Yes, he knew that you had to have the good-looking women, you had to have the comedian, you had to, Burt Williams was one of the great comedians. He was a black man actually from the islands who sang, and he understood the American psyche. And he was the funniest man, but he was also, as W.C. Fields said, he was the funniest sad man I ever met, because he made a ton of money and he was probably the #1 draw, but he did it by playing himself down. There was a song called Nobody. Who does this for me? Nobody. Who brings me my breakfast? Nobody. But he played that part. Flo Ziegfeld developed the Follies. Well, Follies was a lift of the Folie Bergère from Paris, which was, of course, women in scantily clad. He always had one nude shot in every show that he did, and it was usually toward the end, and it was this one nude woman who was beautifully decorated with women all around her. And he's also the first one for Fanny Brice. And Fanny Brice, who did all of these hilarious things, but she also would touch people with, like, my man. Oh, my man, I love him so, he'll never know. And so she was able to do both sides. She wasn't pretty, but boy, could she deliver a song.
What does the music of the 20s and then the 30s tell us about America?
I think it tells us of our eclecticism. We grabbed from every part. You know, one of the things that happened in vaudeville, in just the transition, was we sang along with 100 different things. I Want a Girl Just Like the Girl That Married Dear Old Dad, the Daisy Bicycle Built for Two, East Side, West Side. People loved to sing along these songs. And it was also the development of Tin Pan Alley. And Tin Pan Alley, the name again doesn't really help you. What it was about, the center of it was 5 stories of pianos. And in every room, there were probably 8 to 10 pianos, and at every piano, there was a guy trying to knock out the new Over There, or the new Give My Regards to Broadway. And one of the people was being interviewed, and we don't know who it was exactly, but he was being interviewed by the New York Times to tell us what's the latest song, what's going on. And he said, let's go outside. Everything in here sounds like they're beating on a bunch of tin pans. So that fella, the writer then took that and said Tin Pan Alley. And for an extended period of time, probably 20, 30 years, people stayed there. Now, as a matter of fact, there's still a building that's in New York City that is a 5-story building, and it is the one Tin Pan Alley where all of these writers were trying to crank out that one new piece of music that would make them a millionaire.
Let's fast forward to after World War II.
Okay.
The play South Pacific.
Yes. Yes.
What brought that about, and what was different about that musical than any other musical?
Well, I think one must also consider that Oscar Hammerstein, or Hammerstein, depending on which side of the fence you are, had been involved in Showboat. And Showboat changed everything first. And he was the driving force who said, we're going to play this because this is about black people and white people. And we're going to put this forward. Well, you come to South Pacific, and of course 2 things have happened. James Michener has spent the war, started writing when he was 40 years old, had never written before, but he's in the South Pacific as a supply clerk, and he's writing his little stories, Tales of South Pacific, and then Hawaii, and there's the stories of people not being treated well, of course, and that was the whole thing for Tales of South Pacific. It really wasn't about the war. Yes, the things that he wrote about, he saw. The guys were down here, they were lonesome. Here they are in paradise, and they can't stand it, except that there is this gorgeous young model of a child who is lusted after, and there is the French plantation owner who has been run out of France, and she's a little old girl from Arkansas. How could she put her the feelings that she had growing up aside to marry him? And that really, you have to be taught. It was one of those songs. And if you think about all of the musicals that Rodgers and Hammerstein did from that point on, I mean, look at Oklahoma. Judd was a misfit. He probably should have been in the psych ward. But how we treated him and his abuse.
So you're dealing with a reality. For me, it looks like the late 40s, 50s, really heyday of Broadway musicals.
I think so. I mean, you can go into what we have now, and it's a whole different world. But these guys were they were dealing in a realism that we're not done with yet in the United States. We still have a race problem. And they were able to tell it in a way that they weren't thrown out of the theater. I mean, Flo Ziegfeld was scared to death. He put every nickel he had into Showboat back in 1926, I believe, something like that. And the first night, the people came, packed house, and at the end of it, there was no response. It was quiet. It was silent. And they walked out at the end of the show. And he thought, well, boy, I'm dead. It's all over. Except that they came back the next night and packed it out. And the next night and packed it out. And then they started to understand the message and the great music that they had. I mean, Old Man River and the delivery of Paul Robeson, who became an international star because of Old Man River. But his message, and that was Oscar Hammerstein.
Well, we were talking about musicals and music dealing with social issues. Before we started doing our interview, we talked about Scott Joplin and the fact that he wrote an incredible opera that was never produced because He happened to be African American at the wrong time in our
Right.
history and couldn't get the financial backing
Right.
for that. I want to talk also about technology, and we have all the great musicals and performances. Ethel Merman,
Yes.
she didn't need that little microphone that all these performers have now when they're doing musicals.
No, she did not. But she also didn't have an 18,000 seat house. I mean, that when you look at it, and I'll put in my little 2 cents worth, you'll probably need to edit this out. But I've been to our BOK Center one time. I won't return unless it's a sports event. We are not built to be in a hall that produces about 110 decibels of sound to 18,000 people, because we can't understand a thing that's going on there. It's the excitement, it's not the art. And I don't know if
It's like the event.
it is the event.
With
and
20,000 people or whatever
Let's grab
around
the
you.
beer as we go in, and then let's come back and get another. It has nothing to do with our art. But you're right. Ethel Merman, of course, was one of the vaudeville stars, and there were a number of them who grew from there. Al Jolson, you know, he was in that first musical, in the talking musical that you brought up. And he became more of a star. Evidently, he was kind of hard to live with. But, and there's another show form, by the way, the minstrel show. Now, this was another thing that was a part of our
History.
You bet. I mean, my dad, who was a high school music teacher, was doing minstrel shows into the 50s, 1950s. I didn't understand it at the time, but that's what he grew up with, and he didn't. He I think quit doing anything like that about 1953 or 54. But you go back and you see the growth of what that was. White people putting on blackface and doing shows, and it was a developed standard form. Mr. Interlocutor over here, and all the jokes and all of the pratfalls, everything. That was also running concurrently, so that when we had vaudeville, minstrel shows, book musicals, and then the musical developed from that, and then we had the movies that started and developed. All of these were parallel in the 20s and 30s.
Well, I think what you're telling me is that the music doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is impacted by our values as a society and how our values change. I want to wrap things up talking about where we may be going with music. And I mentioned Ethel Merman. I mean, she did not need a mic. She could hit the back of the auditorium with its. I once read about Frank Sinatra, and that perhaps, and in his talking about his craft, he said that the musical instrument he played was the microphone. He knew how to address that. How is technology impacting the kind of music we're going to have in the future?
Boy, you. If I knew that whole answer, I would be I would get very rich over the next 25 years. I don't know. I really don't know where it is going, because we have moved to a point where people have to have that little microphone hung around their ear. They have capabilities of being all over the hall. They can deliver a song from the back of the audience or the back of the stage. They can hear everything that's going on from an orchestra or a pre-record. Music, it seems to me, and understand that I'm a dinosaur here, and out of touch with that particular pinprick out there that's leading the way, has lost a lot of its melodiousness. Most of the music these days doesn't have something that you can walk out and sing a melody to. Now, that's not all bad, because there's all sorts of creativity that's developing in our young people. But I miss the ability of a group of people to create something together that doesn't require all of those additional things, doesn't require being able to lay down a loop on a computer that we can dump in a bunch of other things on top of it. Where will it go? I really am not sure. I'm anxious to find out. But even in opera, we have the Metropolitan Opera, probably one of the most famous places in the world, seats 3,400 people, 34 to 3,500 people. Many of them need help to get that sound from the middle of the center of the stage to the back of that hall. And so we have allowed the almighty dollar to move us into something that is completely different. And so many people like Ethel Merman. I mean, she was a wonderful show person, but towards the end of her life, you really didn't want to hear her. You know, it was just, and she sounded like a good car trying to start. And so that intimacy that has been always a part of who we are, it's been lost. And that's why, actually, some of the greater stars are coming back unplugged. They're doing things where they'll sit on the edge of the stage and they'll deliver a song in the old way. And to me, that's the best. But like I said, I'm a dinosaur there.
Well, what's the old song, everything old is new again?
Yes.
Perhaps we'll see a little bit more of that. Barry Epperley, always great visiting with you.
Thanks, Loren.
And thank you for joining us for Studio 21.